We swim in a sea of language. The way we use words affects the way we think, the things we see and hear. Language is always changing, dynamic. Words evolve, go out of fashion, change meanings, develop new meanings. From the women's movement, we know that language can be used to liberate. The way we use language to understand words can perpetuate the marginalization of persons with disabilities. The various meanings assigned to a word can group together and associate in a way to say what is not intended, or to say what we're not conscious of, to say what was commonly thought centuries ago. We still have the associations of all the meanings of words. When we use them in one context with one meaning that we want to convey, we carry along with that word all of the different ways people have understood it and the ways people use it.
I think most people do not think of where words come from. They don't dig deep into them.
Well, language is a very powerful tool. So we need to be careful how we use words.
When you look at the terminology, I think it's just a negative, another added barrier to the disabled population.
In this video, we are concentrating on 3 words that are often used about disabled people, and in fact about disabled people near the end of life, or who are seen as somehow being near the end of life. These 3 words are vulnerable, suffering, and compassion. In Manitoba, some people are defined as vulnerable under the Vulnerable Persons Act. The professional and legal use of the word vulnerable can often marginalize and oppress people so designated, whether they are children, elderly people, or people with disabilities. This usage implies that persons with disabilities intrinsically, by their very nature, are vulnerable.
People will automatically assume, because you can't walk, or because you can't talk, or because you can't see, that you are more vulnerable, that you need to be taken care of.
I would hesitate to use the word vulnerable in relation to people with disabilities unless I added in front of the word vulnerable, made vulnerable. People are made vulnerable.
There is a kind of logic underlying the notion of vulnerability. As we follow that logic, if disabled people are vulnerable, and if we don't want bad things to happen to disabled people, we'll have to protect them. The impulse to protect the vulnerable often expresses itself in very oppressive ways. People with disabilities being kept in institutional confinement, people with disabilities being prevented from making decisions and choices.
I don't consider myself vulnerable, even though I am a person with a disability.
I just don't like the idea that people look at me as a woman with a disability who uses an electric wheelchair, that I'm more vulnerable. Everybody's vulnerable.
I'd rather people treated me not as vulnerable, but with dignity and respect.
Let's admit that it's the circumstances, the social context often, that makes people vulnerable. It's our poverty, it's our isolation, it's the way people see and view us and value us. Those are the things that make us vulnerable. Suffering provides an example of a word with many meanings. Some definitions of suffering are very neutral. Very early meanings were to carry or experience something. Other definitions of suffering are associated with pain, or to designate a particular disability, as in, he suffers from cerebral palsy, or she suffers from polio. When the same word is used to mean pain and to designate disability, their meanings become intertwined. When people see someone with a disability, particularly when their bodies are formed differently, the assumption is often that they are suffering pain.
I cringe every time I hear members of the public use the word suffering when they're describing people with disabilities. Suffering is a dehumanizing term.
When it pops up as just a simple connecting verb, really, to say that so-and-so suffers from cerebral palsy, or suffers from epilepsy, or suffers from paraplegia, the word seems so innocent, really.
I think the worst word for people to be described as is suffering. They suffer from epilepsy. I'm thinking, no, I don't suffer from polio. I have polio, just like I have dark hair. Now I have gray hair. But realistically, it's not that you suffer from it.
There are widespread perceptions in our broader society, within our culture, that we, as disabled people, suffer from our impairments, from the physical or psychiatric conditions that give rise to our disability. So that we suffer losses, that we suffer pain, that we suffer a kind of anguish simply because we have these disabilities, because our bodies, for example, don't conform.
There's an assumption made that people with disabilities are suffering or in pain because of the fact that they have a disability.
In the Middle Ages, the word suffering was used as a euphemism for executing or putting to death. The word suffer is also very much associated with the end of life, because suffering is often used to rationalize or justify the ending of life. Its association with disability is very dangerous.
There is an intrinsic assessment of suffering and an extrinsic. Do we decide for ourselves whether we are suffering, or is someone else going to be making that decision for us?
When the word suffering is used in relation to persons with disabilities, I think people often feel they have to alleviate us from our suffering.
If we suffer, and if suffering defines our lives and is all that we experience, or our predominant experience, then why would, it begs the question, why would we want to live?
It to me portrays disability as a life of complete negativity. Nothing enviable about our lives, nothing worthy in our lives. So of course it's going to be equated with death, or that death is preferable to disability.
Suffering has visual and auditory images that immediately come to mind when you use it, and you almost need a cleaner term that doesn't have all these past associations with it.
I don't feel that I'm suffering. I don't feel like I'm vulnerable.
Our lives are rich and they are complex.
Disabled or not, we all experience pain, oppression, or humiliation. We each have the right to decide whether we experience these conditions as suffering or just another part of our lives. The basic root meaning of compassion has meant feeling with or sharing the experience of another. However, compassion depends on the ability to authentically understand what another is experiencing or feeling. Research has consistently shown that people without disabilities often assume that disabled persons' quality of life is very low. Persons with disabilities, on the other hand, generally rate their quality of life as good as others. People with disabilities are skeptical of the word compassion. They are informed by their experience of a social reality where pity and sympathy often masquerade as compassion. Pity objectifies and creates distance between the person feeling pity and the person being pitied. And it is a distance in power, so that the one being pitied is not only distanced, but is also made less powerful, and therefore less worthy. This can have dire consequences.
The notion that at its root, compassion means feeling with, fellow feeling. It's a word that links very closely with the word empathy and is quite distinct from that other problematic word of sympathy.
Well, compassion makes me think of pity or sympathy, and that's not something persons with disabilities want. They don't want pity, they don't want sympathy.
Do I think people with disabilities deserve more compassion? No. Again, I think it's that pity thing, and I'm not a pity person. I think people without disabilities sometimes believe that people with disabilities are automatically powerless, that they're automatically in pain, and that they're deserving of people's sympathy, i.e., I feel sorry for you.
Compassion is also used to justify assisted suicide and euthanasia. In this extreme, wrongly based on negative ideas about disability, compassion becomes very dangerous for us. In fact, it has been suggested in the House of Commons, in Parliament, in Canada, that a new law be created in the Criminal Code under the general term compassionate homicide, and that the penalty for compassionate homicide would be less when compassion is used to justify the homicide of someone.
The phrase compassionate homicide is an excellent example, a really, I'm afraid, a very chilling and disturbing example of how very far off the mark the meaning of this word has strayed, because the word compassion most frequently now, when used in relation to people with disabilities, follows that logic of first exaggerating the suffering of the disabled person, accounting for that suffering in terms of his or her vulnerability, and then responding to that suffering and that vulnerability with a compassion that consists only of, in many cases, arguing for the termination of that person's life as the ultimate expression of this thing called compassion.
I would not necessarily use the words vulnerable, suffering, and compassion in relation to people with disabilities. Most people with disabilities are generally content with their lives. They are not suffering. People with disabilities are not inherently more vulnerable than anyone else. And people with disabilities don't automatically need compassionate feelings from others.
I think continually using those words in a way which does not preserve the dignity of a person with disability, it just perpetuates the stereotypes.
And these words have become such flashpoints in public, particularly, that I really think we should be addressing the underlying stereotypes and possibly and encourage the use of other words.
The words vulnerable and suffering have a somewhat negative connotation. They do not suggest a sense of power or control.
Yes, I'm not a victim, I'm not suffering, I'm not, vulnerable. I'm just me.
Language belongs to all of us, and it can be challenged and changed. We can set a good example in the words we choose and how we use them. And we can also challenge the way words are used by other people by suggesting better words. We can think about and plan and shape the way society uses language about disabled people. We can reclaim language.